1400 years, it has eluded man. Vague rumors, questionable evidence, all have led to dead ends in man's endless search for the monster. Until now, for as surely as you hear my voice, the Loch Ness Monster lives. Terrible in its power to drive men mad with fear. See for yourself when the Loch Ness Monster surfaces. At the old country Busch Gardens Williamsburg.
Loch Ness Monster at Busch Gardens Williamsburg has to be one of the best named roller coasters in existence. Based after the famous Loch Ness Monster, a creature in Scottish folklore that inhabits Loch Ness in the Scottish Highlands, it is located in the Scotland section of Busch Gardens, where it has been thrilling riders since 1978. The interlocking vertical loops are quite famous and are easily one of the most visually striking elements on any roller coaster out there. Being an older attraction, it was built in a time before computers were used to design or manufacture amusement rides. Thus, Loch Ness Monster debuted with problems and issues that many of you may have never imagined or heard about. In this video, we'll explore the operational issues and misconceptions about the coaster, such as its interlocking vertical loops, as well as take a deep dive into the ride's history and experience. This video will serve as the first part in a small series that links the problems of Loch Ness Monster to the even more problematic roller coaster, Drachen Fire, which would open at Busch Gardens Williamsburg 14 years later in 1992. Before we get started, I'd just like to mention that Loch Ness Monster is a perfectly safe roller coaster, and you are in no danger when riding it. In fact, I highly recommend a ride on Loch Ness Monster because it's one of the best classic looping roller coasters still in existence. Many of you are probably familiar with Anheuser-Busch, a famous American brewing company. It traces its origins back to 1852. Since then, Anheuser-Busch has grown massively and is now the world's largest brewing company. During the mid-1960s, Anheuser-Busch were searching for a location in Virginia to build a new brewery plant. The company had an option to buy land in Newport News, Virginia, but Winthrop Rockefeller, then governor of Arkansas and chairman of the board of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, convinced the company to purchase land near the colonial capital of Williamsburg, Virginia. A deal was made where alongside the brewery plant, Anheuser-Busch would build a new residential area, as well as a theme park to help boost tourism in the Williamsburg area, just as they had done with their parks in Florida and California. The company's parks, known as Busch Gardens, were built as marketing vehicles for their breweries and featured different hospitality houses where guests could sample different Anheuser-Busch products. With an initial investment of $40 million US, Anheuser-Busch purchased over 3,000 acres of land just east of Williamsburg on the James River and constructed their new brewery plant. They would go on to sell their first barrel of beer from the new brewery in 1972. In 1973, Anheuser-Busch's board of directors approved plans for a theme park on the site adjacent to the brewery, and construction began in 1974. A condition was made when Anheuser-Busch purchased their land that meant the park couldn't be themed to early America, since that could detract from the historical site in Williamsburg. So the park was themed after different countries in Europe as they were in the 17th and 18th centuries. Thus, the park was originally named Busch Gardens The Old Country, with the slogan, "The Old Country on this side of the Atlantic." After only 1 year of construction, the new theme park would officially make its grand debut on May 16, 1975, in which over 6,000 guests would be in attendance. This was following the park's unofficial opening weekend on May 10th and 11th, where 31,000 guests were in attendance. The park was built around a man-made lake named the Rhine River and opened with different sections themed to England, Scotland, France, and Germany. Some of the park's opening day attractions included Le Mans Speedway in France, an antique car attraction that was later replaced by Griffon in 2007, as well as Glissade, a Schwarzkopf jumbo jet roller coaster located in Germany. The Old Country proved to be a hit. Visitors loved the architecture and old-world villages that brought a new level of sophistication to theme parks. By Labor Day weekend, the theme park already met its attendance projection for the entire year of 1.3 million visitors. And not only did the Old Country do well, but as hoped for, the theme park helped boost tourism in the Williamsburg area. Colonial Williamsburg saw record attendance in 1975. And in just June of that year, retail spending doubled to $10 million compared to $5 million in June of 1974, with the goal of making major improvements to the Old Country every year. And to inspire an even more successful second season, 1976 saw the addition of a new 10-acre land to Germany, Oktoberfest. Oktoberfest debuted the famous Festhaus, a 21,000 square foot building for shows and dining, as well as 8 new rides. Of those 8 new rides, 2 were roller coasters: the kiddie roller coaster Das Katschken, built by the Alan Herschel Company, and Die Wildkatze, a Schwarzkopf Wildcat coaster, which was later removed in 1983 to make room for the station of the swinging suspended roller coaster Big Bad Wolf, a ride I hope to one day cover in the problematic roller coaster series. Anheuser-Busch also operated a Busch Gardens park in Tampa Bay, Florida, which today goes by the name Busch Gardens Tampa Bay. In early 1976, the company rebranded the park as Busch Gardens The Dark Continent and looked to introduce aspects of live entertainment, advertising, animal displays, and thrill rides centralized around an older African theme. As part of a $7.6 million 18-month expansion project, Anheuser-Busch purchased a $2 million roller coaster from the renowned Aero Development. In that day and age, Aero Development were leaders in providing theme park attractions and had developed many hit rides and roller coasters all over the United States. The new roller coaster would be called Python and would be part of Congo, a new themed area set to debut in 1976. Python was not only the park's first roller coaster, but also the first looping roller coaster in the state of Florida. It was a clone of Corkscrew at Knott's Berry Farm, which had debuted just 1 year prior. Riders ascended a 72-foot tall lift hill, were taken down a 50-foot first drop, reached speeds of 40 miles per hour, and along the ride's 1,200 feet of track, traversed a double corkscrew, which was state-of-the-art for the time. Overall, the ride was highly successful and increased park attendance by 12.6% during July 1976, and helped attribute for an overall 2.5% attendance increase for the 1976 season. As I mentioned earlier, Anheuser-Busch wished to make major improvements to their parks every year to help convince regional residents to make return visits. In the case of the Old Country, the park faced competition from King's Dominion, a brand new and nearby theme park that also opened in 1975. In fact, it was just over an hour away from Busch Gardens. Built by the Taft Broadcasting Company, King's Dominion opened with Rebel Yell, a twin-tracked racing wooden roller coaster that was more impressive than the roller coasters offered at Busch Gardens. And in 1977, King's Dominion introduced their 4th roller coaster, King Cobra, a Schwarzkopf launching shuttle loop coaster which debuted as the first launching roller coaster at King's Dominion and in the state of Virginia. The ride featured a state-of-the-art vertical loop that riders traversed both forwards and backwards. With the goals of both improving the Old Country and remaining competitive with King's Dominion, Anheuser-Busch set out to do just that. On July 27, 1977, the company announced that they would be introducing Loch Ness Monster, a new $5 million thrill ride that would be located in Heather Downs, a part of the park's Scottish section. Not many details were given at the time of announcement due to, quote, competitive reasons, but the park did claim that the new attraction would by far be the largest ride at the Old Country and would travel above a lake. Construction of Loch Ness Monster wouldn't begin until December of 1977. On March 2nd, 1978, the press finally got to take an in-person look at the new roller coaster, and all the details were finally out of the bag. The park described the ride as, quote, the most awesome, frightening, and extraordinary thrill ride in history. Loch Ness Monster would debut as the world's tallest and fastest roller coaster with the steepest drop in the world. It would be designed and built by Aero Development, the same company who had successfully opened Python, but Loch Ness Monster would be far larger. It would stand 130 feet tall, feature a 114-foot first drop sloped at 55 degrees, reach speeds greater than 60 miles per hour, race along 3,240 feet of track, feature a large indoor helix dubbed the Monster's Lair, where trains would complete 2 3/4 full rotations in total darkness, and sport the world's first pair of interlocking vertical loops. For the time period, the ride was truly breathtaking. While construction during the months of January and February was slow due to bad weather, the crew of 6 structural steel ironworkers were able to charge forward and erect the giant coaster as they stuck to the opening day target of June 2nd, 1978. On April 13th, 1978, the steel workers held a topping out ceremony symbolizing that all the steel structure was in place and the ride was nearing completion. However, there was still a lot of work to do, like final welding of the track and structure, tour, construction of the monster's lair, and a lot of landscaping. The ride would begin testing sometime after that, with trains that were 6 cars in length as originally planned. Many of you may know that Loch Ness Monster operates with trains that are 7 cars long, but the original plan was to run trains 6 cars in length, with an overall 4 trains on the track at once. But at some point before the ride officially opened to the public, 4 train operations were deemed over the top, and the decision was made to operate Loch Ness Monster with 3 trains that were 7 cars long instead. I'll get more detailed on this later in the video. Loch Ness Monster opened to the public on June 2nd of 1978, just as planned. For the first official ride, 8 figures known internationally for their heroic and bold achievements were chosen to ride alongside Governor John Dalton and August Busch, the 3rd president of Anheuser-Busch. Overall, reception of the all-new Loch Ness Monster was exceptional. Guests were in awe of the ride's size, and the speed of the first drop blew them all away. Loch Ness Monster lured in all sorts of thrill seekers and actually led to CoasterCon 1, the first national roller coaster convention held by the American Coaster Enthusiasts, or ACE, to be held in 1978. Roy Brashears, organizer of the convention and head of ACE at the time, said, quote, "The Loch Ness Monster is definitely the best steel coaster ride in the world. The ride begins with a dip out of the station into a slight left curve, followed by a right-hand turnaround into the ride's first lift hill, which hoists the train up 85 feet, but to an overall height of 130 feet above the Rhine River. A small pre-drop leads into a right turn, followed by a 114.2-foot drop at 55 degrees down to the lake, where trains reach a top speed of greater than 60 miles per hour. Riders in the back cars receive a good amount of airtime. This leads to a second hill placed 91 feet above the lake. The train banks left and heads through a left-hand 180-degree turnaround and then into a small incline. This leads into a 57-foot drop, delivering another great moment of airtime for riders in the back rows, even with this drop having trim brakes that slow the coaster's speed. The train reaches 43 miles per hour before tearing through an 82-foot tall vertical loop. At the top of the loop's 30-foot diameter, the train is traveling 23 miles per hour. This leads into another incline, offering a good pop of airtime for riders in the front cars, followed by a right-hand turn to a small incline that takes the train up into a brake run. The train enters the monster's lair and begins a downward counterclockwise spiral with a diameter of 40 feet, where the train completes 2 3/4 complete rotations, with the track varying and banking from 45 to 55 degrees. After 18 seconds in the dark, the train emerges from the lair and reaches a speed of 27 miles per hour. The track then quickly darts up and then flattens into a trim brake, followed by the second lift hill. This lift hill is much smaller than the first and is only 75 feet above the lake. This leads into a pre-drop, followed by a wide right turn through the woods. Next is a 66-foot drop, where the train reaches 43 miles per hour and enters a 57-foot tall vertical loop that interlocks with the first vertical loop. Dimensionally, the second loop is completely identical to the first, but is located closer to ground level. The train bottoms out of the second loop and then climbs upward and to the right into the ride's deceleration lane or final brake run, and then into the station, ending the ride. Without question, Loch Ness Monster was cutting edge when it first opened. Manufacturing and design practices were far more limited in that day and age, and what Arrow accomplished in that time was breathtaking. The company were truly leaders in the innovation of thrill rides at the time. Loch Ness Monster was designed by Ron Toomer, a former rocket engineer who helped develop the heat shield used during the Apollo program and went on to design 93 roller coasters at Arrow. Now, Arrow were pioneers in roller coaster design and construction, but manufacturing abilities of the time set limitations. When riding Loch Ness Monster, you will feel the ride jerk in varying amounts as it transitions between different curves. And by curve, I mean a turn to the right or left, or the valley between the drop of one hill and ascent into the next. Anytime you feel a jerk, this is caused by a sudden change in centripetal acceleration, otherwise known as G-forces. Let me explain why. At the time, Arrow bent their track by hand because of fabrication limitations. In fact, bending track by hand apparently led to a piece of track on the ride's ending ascent into the final brake run to be curved to the left instead of to the right. That piece of track had to be heated and bent back in the proper direction on the construction site, and apparently, a jolt can still be felt today where that correction was made. But because the track was bent by hand, Arrow had to use continuous radiuses in all curves of their coasters. When I say continuous radiuses, I mean that each curve would feature its own consistent radius, just like a circle. At the end of the day, Arrow's coasters consisted of straight lines and circles. According to Alan Schilke, who was quite a legendary coaster designer and used to work at Arrow, track fabricators would heat and bend tubular steel track to match a wooden board that represented the desired curve. They would heat and bend the track until it matched the board, and once it matched, they knew the piece was the correct shape. The problem with this is when a coaster train transitions from a straight piece of track to a curve, or from one curve to another curve, each curve needs to start and end gradually so that the change in acceleration doesn't occur rapidly. This is how today's roller coasters are designed. But with Arrow's use of continuous radiuses, the transition from the straight track of Loch Ness Monster's 55-degree drop to the continuous radius of the valley into the second hill causes a jerk, because the curve of the valley doesn't begin gradually. Arrow's vertical loops also exert jerks as the train transitions from the wider radius of the lower loop to the tighter radius of the upper loop. Another jerk that is more pleasant in my opinion occurs on the drop into the ride's first loop. The downward curve as the drop gets steeper follows a continuous radius. So as the train speeds up down the drop, riders in the back cars get a sudden pop of airtime towards the end of the curve, because the curve doesn't grow any wider, which is something I love, but it can lead to an uncomfortable transition into the vertical loop as the acceleration rapidly switches from negative g-forces to positive g-forces, especially in the back cars. But the use of continuous radiuses gets worse on the turns of Arrow's coasters, especially when banking is involved. With the turn, the transition into a continuous radius causes a rapid switch in lateral acceleration, which is side to side. And for a ride like Loch Ness Monster that has over-the-shoulder restraints, it means you have a good chance of hitting your head or neck against the restraint due to the rapid switch of forces. But when Arrow would bank a turn, meaning it was tilted to the left or right, the company did not utilize something called heartlining. Heartlining is where the rotation of track as it banks to the right or left places a rider's heart, or really their chest, at the center of rotation. This is important because a rider's chest is their center of mass. Today's roller coasters feature heartlining, and it means that the track of a coaster rotates around your center of mass. This reduces the lateral forces exerted on riders. But Arrow's coasters of the time did not feature heartlining for a few reasons. I believe one of those reasons was because it was harder to design for that without computers, and coaster designers of the time were more concerned with the forces trains would exert on the track and structure, and less so the riders. So on Arrow's coasters, the track would rotate around itself like so, and heartlining would impose more forces on the trains, track, and structure, but it meant that a rider's center of mass was rotated around the track instead, rather than the track rotating around your center of mass like on today's roller coasters. This makes it feel like you were being tipped on your side. Then combine that with the sharp transitions into or out of a turn with the use of continuous radiuses, and this leads to massive amounts of headbanging that Arrow's looping roller coasters are filled with. Thankfully, Loch Ness Monster doesn't feature many quick changes in banking, so the ride is relatively smooth compared to some of Arrow's other looping coasters like Drachen Fire. Another issue was that Arrow didn't always predict speed correctly, especially as their coasters grew larger. On the smaller part of Loch Ness Monster, so the second lift hill into the second vertical loop, Arrow accurately predicted the correct speed. But on the ride's larger first half, I believe Arrow over-accounted for the amount of speed that would be lost to friction and wind resistance. I believe since the ride first opened, there has been a trim brake installed on the drop into the first loop that reduces each train to the same speed that trains enter the second loop. This issue would persist over and over again, even into the early 1990s, on rides like Viper at Six Flags Magic Mountain or Steel Phantom at Kennywood, which both require trim brakes to slow trains down by a large amount. But even with these design and manufacturing limitations, Loch Ness Monster isn't very rough, and that's part of the reason the ride is in existence today. Loch Ness Monster has never been my absolute favorite looping roller coaster built by Arrow Development, but it's probably the best well-rounded example of what Arrow did with their looping coasters. It combines the right amount of intensity, height, speed, and length with an acceptable amount of smoothness that has kept the ride popular with the general public over all these years, unlike Drachen Fire, which immediately became unpopular. Safety standards were also different in the 1970s. For one, the ride had no air gates in the station, meaning nothing physically held back the line of guests waiting for the next train. A lot of trust was held in the common sense of humans in those days, so it was trusted that guests wouldn't be dumb enough to get in the way of a moving train and injure themselves. Another major difference were the ride's restraints. The original restraints on Arrow's looping roller coasters were much thinner and nicknamed horse collar restraints, compared to the wider over-the-shoulder restraints that became standard on Arrow's looping coasters just a few years later. The original restraints let riders put their arms up, but the danger in this was that clearances and reach envelopes were not a thing in these times, so it was possible for riders on the trains to reach their arms out and touch objects in the nearby vicinity. And when traveling at a high rate of speed, this could certainly lead to injury. But just like with the lack of air gates, it was trusted that a simple warning warning sign telling guests to keep their hands and arms inside the train was enough. To make this even crazier, I don't believe the ride elements on Arrow's coasters were designed with reach envelopes in mind. The vertical loops on Arrow's coasters are narrow, with the inbound and outbound tracks being maybe inches away from each other, just wide enough for the two sections of track to pass by each other without touching one another. If a rider on the inside seat were to stretch their arm out ever so slightly, they'd whack the other end of the loop at around 40 miles per hour, which would certainly lead to injury. And with Arrow's copy and paste design and manufacturing method, this was a design flaw present on every single one of their coasters with a vertical loop. Eventually, common sense wouldn't be trusted, and the horse collar restraints were replaced with the more modern design that grow wider over the shoulders. This prevents riders from placing their arms in the air and reaching out of the cars, which in my opinion is a much safer practice than trusting millions of riders with varying IQ levels. Air gates were also added to the ride's load station as a further precaution to keep guests away from moving trains. Another vintage aspect of Loch Ness Monster was its original control system that monitored and controlled the motion of trains. Today's roller coasters are monitored and controlled by something called a Programmable Logic Controller, or PLC. PLCs are specialized computers that automate a process by receiving data through various inputs, making decisions based on the collected data, and then producing outputs based on its decisions. On roller coasters, PLCs are what control a ride's block zone system. For those of you who are unfamiliar, a block zone is a section of ride that only one train may occupy. At the end of a block zone is a method to stop a train in case the block zone ahead is still occupied. This is the safety system that prevents roller coaster trains from colliding with one another. So PLCs basically collect data from proximity sensors located around a ride and monitor the location of trains on the track. Once a train enters a new block zone, the PLC will send an output to the block zone the train was previously in. This output will cause the next approaching train to stop at a control point within that previous block zone until the next block zone ahead is unoccupied. This keeps the train from entering the next block zone if it's still occupied, which avoids a collision. Today, Loch Ness Monster has the following block zones. A block, which is from the end of the station to the crest of lift number 1. Then B block, which is right from the crest of lift 1 to the end of the brake run before the helix. Next is C block, which is from the helix to the crest of lift number 2. And then D block, which is from the crest of lift number 2 to the end of the ready brake before the station. The station itself is also a block zone, but isn't technically part of the block zone system. I hear that the ride may have opened with the 6th block zone between the station and first lift hill like so. There were apparently brakes installed on this section of straight track before the turnaround, as well as another brake on the track right before the first lift. This probably allowed for trains to dispatch from the station before the train ahead dropped off the lift hill. So a train approaching the lift hill would be able to engage the lift just as the train ahead was disengaging it. This system of block zones was originally controlled and monitored by something called relay logic, which predates the more modern day PLC system. Relay-based control systems rely on electromechanical relay switches. Think of them as light switches that turn circuits on and off. They're also controlled by sensors on the track, and when a train passes a specific sensor, it'll trigger a corresponding relay switch that turns connected electrical circuits on or off. Say if a train is passing through the brake run at the end of B block and has now fully entered C block, the train will pass a sensor that triggers a relay switch that sets the brakes at the end of B block. In this action, picture that the switch is essentially cutting power to the electrical circuit that keeps the brakes open, like when you flick a light switch to turn off a light bulb. With the relay switch set, the brakes close, and so now if an incoming train were to approach the end of B block, the brakes will stop this incoming train and prevent it from entering the occupied C block. Once the train ahead crests the second lift hill, meaning it has fully exited C block and has fully entered D block, it'll pass a sensor that triggers another relay switch. This action turns the power on for the brakes at the end of B block, which opens and unsets the brakes. Now an approaching train will be able to coast through and enter C block since it's unoccupied. But simultaneously, as the train ahead entered D block, it also triggered a relay switch that leads to power being cut to the second lift hill if a train were to reach the crest of the lift or the end of C block before the train ahead had fully exited D block. Relay systems like the one on Loch Ness Monster were common on roller coasters in that day and age, as they were proven, reliable, and simple. The downside was that electromechanical relays often stick or burn out and need to be replaced, as I don't believe they last long, especially with them being switched on and off hundreds of times a day. I'll get more into the benefits of a PLC control system in a bit, but let's explore how the original relay system was meant to support 4-train operations on Loch Ness Monster. While the ride had either 5 or 6 block zones, which is enough to support 4-train operations, I don't think the ride's designers had a good enough understanding of how long trains would take to complete certain sections of the ride. For instance, the ride's original fact sheet from 1978 claimed a theoretical capacity of 2,000 riders per hour. With the originally planned 6-car trains that held 24 riders each, this means at least 83.3 dispatches an hour, so let's go with 83 dispatches. This means a train needs to be dispatched roughly every 43.4 seconds, and then each train on the ride course would be 43.4 seconds apart from each other. But this is actually not possible because the train would set up or come to a stop at the top of the first lift hill because the train ahead has not yet cleared the end of B block. So right off the bat, either Arrow lied about the ride's capacity, or I believe they miscalculated how long it would take trains to run through different sections of the ride. I don't know if the original intention was to have 2 trains in the vertical loops, but at a 43-second interval, the trains are so close together that a train hits the first vertical loop before the train ahead hits the second loop, like so. When I reduce down to a 52-second dispatch interval, that seems to be the minimum time that allows B block to clear before a train reaches the top of the first lift hill. It also gives enough time to avoid setups in the ride's other block zones. This means just about 69 dispatches per hour, very nice, with a true theoretical capacity of 1,656 riders, with 24 passenger trains, still very good. As far as the interlocking loops though, a train still hits the first loop before the train ahead reaches the second loop. But overall, 4-train operations wouldn't pan out because Loch Ness Monster was not built to properly stack its trains at the end of the ride if a holdup occurred in the load station. From what I understand, Arrow offered the option to manufacture their coasters with the ability to stack all trains on the final brake run like Corkscrew at Cedar Point, or the option to have a short brake run where stacking all trains wasn't possible like Loch Ness Monster. This was an option that many parks went with, such as Cedar Point, because safety standards were a lot simpler in those times, and it was common to dispatch trains very quickly, so slow dispatches and stacking trains were pretty rare. But 4-train operations congested Loch Ness Monster's layout to the point where it made no sense. You could not stretch a dispatch interval much longer than 52 seconds as you needed to keep all trains in motion. And keep in mind that 52 seconds was already crazy because that doesn't account for the 30 seconds of idle time between when a train dispatches and the next one parks in the station. So there was only about 22 seconds to unload and load a train. When you stretch a dispatch interval slightly too long, maybe even by 10 seconds, it leads to a domino effect. The train approaching the station will stop in D block because the station is still occupied. Then even if the ride crew dispatches from the station just a few seconds later, the train rolling off D block will take longer to do so because it's starting from a dead stop, meaning the train behind it will reach the crest of the second lift hill before the train ahead has cleared D block, forcing this other train to stop at the crest. Once that happens, it's game over. Any train that sets or block checks in C block, B block, or A block will not automatically advance forward once the block zone ahead clears. So the 4th train on the track will end up setting in B block in the brake run before the helix. Both the trains stopped in C block and B block will need to be manually restarted by a ride operator at the main control panel and another ride operator at a separate enable panel nearby the physical locations of the block zones. So once a train sets on the second lift hill, the ride is essentially broken down. Because of this, I don't think Loch Ness Monster ever opened with 4 trains in operation. The ride instead operated with a max of 3 trains, which made a lot more sense. It gave ride operators more wiggle room and allowed for each train to be further apart from one another, meaning more time between dispatches, which allowed for a longer unload and load process of each train. It also eliminated the domino effect of setting trains on C block, B block, and even A block. Now the only concern was setting a train on C block or the second lift hill if ride crews were slow in the station and stacked the 3rd train. But this was less of a concern since in most cases there shouldn't have been a train that would set in B block. I believe when the ride first opened, it still ran the original 6-car trains, but sometime during the opening year, the trains were lengthened to 7 cars to help increase capacity since 4-train operations didn't work out. The added time between dispatches meant that 2 trains could now be in the interlocking loops at once. To achieve this, it required a dispatch interval of roughly 63 seconds, as it takes 63 seconds between when a train hits the first loop to when it hits the second loop. At this dispatch rate, that yields roughly 57 dispatches an hour, and and with 7-car 28-passenger trains yields an hourly capacity of 1,596 riders per hour. Now that is not an easy dispatch interval to hit, so it wasn't every cycle that 2 trains would be dueling through the vertical loops, but when it would happen, it was certainly a special treat. These are various clips from the 1990s showing 2 trains in the vertical loops at once, and what's cool is that some of these clips were filmed after air gates were added to the station, yet ride crews were still able to dispatch trains fast enough to duel in the interlocking loops. With the new longer dispatch interval that was longer than intended, the 6 block zone before the first lift hill was removed sometime during the 1980s, as there was no need to dispatch a train from the station before the train ahead cleared the first lift. This is how the ride has operated for most of its career, with just 5 block zones. Sometime in the mid-1990s, the ride's original relay switch control system was replaced with a more modern PLC. PLCs operate the same way as relay logic systems, but are far more flexible and can do much more. This is because PLCs are programmable and can carry out advanced tasks with the data it collects. PLCs not only manage the block system of a ride, but can also be used to monitor the speed of trains at various points along the ride, adjust the level of braking around the ride based on a train's measured speed as well as weather conditions like wind, and even count each individual car of a train as it passes by certain locations to make sure all cars are accounted for. PLCs also make it easier to diagnose any ride or system faults. Today's PLCs can list the exact error that has occurred, so the ride's original relay system was perfectly safe, but a PLC is a much smarter and advanced alternative that helped modernize the ride. This upgrade was followed by an unfortunate downgrade. Sometime around 2002, the first lift hill was slowed down. I don't know how fast the original lift was, but based off this POV recorded on March 25th, 2002, it takes 72 seconds from when a train dispatches to when it hits the B block enter proximity sensor located right here. This sensor is placed right where gravity takes over and trains fall off the first lift hill into the course, and allows the next train to dispatch from the station. With the minimum dispatch interval reduced to 72 seconds, trains were no longer able to duel in the loop since the loops are 63 seconds apart from one another. It also meant a maximum of 50 dispatches an hour and a theoretical 1,400 riders per hour. I've heard that this was done to save on wear and tear of the first lift hill's motor, and also to help avoid setting trains on the second lift hill during 3-train operations, but I don't believe it had anything to do with wear and tear on the structures of the vertical loops, because each loop is built independently from each other, so only the ground would feel the additional weight of having 2 trains in the loops at a time. As time continued into the 2000s, safety protocols became more in-depth and better accommodation was provided for ADA riders, which can cause longer dispatch intervals, so it appears that the first lift hill has been slowed down even further. In this POV recorded in 2017, it takes 80 seconds from when a train dispatches to when it passes the B block enter prox, meaning a minimum dispatch interval of 80 seconds, which meant a maximum of 45 dispatches per hour and an hourly theoretical capacity of 1,260 riders. At this point in time, the ride still had 3 available trains for 3-train operations, and I'd imagine the further slowdown was to further prevent the possibility of setting up on C block. For the 2018 season, which was Loch Ness Monster's 40th anniversary, Busch Gardens purchased 2 brand new trains from S&S Worldwide and retired the ride's original fleet of trains. Arrow unfortunately went out of business in the early 2000s, and S&S now supports Arrow's original coasters. The new trains are replicas of the originals, and thus they feature identical chassis. The bodies of the cars also look identical, but are made from different materials. The original Arrow bodies were built from wood and fiberglass with cable tie cross bracing, while the new S&S trains are built from steel and fiberglass, so they're much more modern. The ride used to have 2 storage tracks underneath the station to hold trains, and that has since been reduced to just 1 storage track. Ironically, the park has increased the speed of Lift 1, most likely to reduce the cycle time and to help increase capacity, especially since with 2 trains, the risk of setting a train in C block or B block is greatly reduced. It now takes about 63 seconds from when a train is dispatched to when it passes the B block enter prox. Coincidentally, 63 seconds is the exact amount of time between when a train enters the first loop to when it enters the second, meaning it's possible to have 2 trains perfectly in the interlocking loops at once. but you'll probably never see this happen when the ride is open to guests, as it requires a short unload and load cycle. But when testing in the morning, ride mechanics will dispatch the next train as soon as the one ahead hits the B block Interprocs, leading to perfect duels in the interlocking loops. Now this is just my fantasy, but I bet perfect duels in the interlocking loops could be done during some sort of roller coaster enthusiast event. To do so would be pretty simple, but it would start by loading 2 trains with riders and sending them out into the course at any dispatch rate. 2 trains in the loops would not occur on this run. Then when the first train returns to the station, all riders would remain in the train. The ride crew would quickly lock and recheck all restraints. Once the second train is approaching the station, the crew would dispatch and roll the second train into the station immediately after. The same process would repeat with all riders remaining in the train. The ride crew would quickly lock and recheck restraints and get ready to dispatch the train. Once the train ahead hits the B block Interprocs, they would dispatch the second train, leading to a perfect duel in the interlocking loops. Now again, this is a fantasy of mine, but if someone important from Busch Gardens is watching, please consider this. Myself, and I bet a lot of other coaster enthusiasts, would certainly pay to experience the interlocking vertical loops, preferably in the daytime when we can see the other train. Now all is still not perfect with Loch Ness Monster, and something that has been an issue with the ride since probably day 1 is the brake run at the end of B block. This brake run was designed with the original 6-car trains in mind, so it's short in length. With 7-car trains, a full stop in this brake run can cause the tail end of the train to hang off the brake run, to the point where a few cars may still be on the incline up into the brake run. When this happens, it means the train can roll backwards into the first loop if the brakes are released. The ride is programmed to trim trains to a stop if C block is still occupied. Trimming the train to a stop ensures that the entire train climbs up the incline before stopping. But let's say if an E-stop is pressed by a ride operator while a train is traversing B block, the brakes will bring the train to a dead stop, leaving the rear end of the train hanging off the brake run. To combat this issue, there is a winch permanently installed on the brake run that is used to hoist trains all the way up the incline. However, the issues continue. Arrow most likely envisioned that this brake run would only be used in cases of emergency, and that even with regular 4-train operations, trains would have had to rarely stop in this location. So the brake run is technically sloped downhill, but just ever so slightly. It's nearly flat. When trains trim to a stop at this location, even with all cars fully up the incline, when the brakes release, the train will not always roll forward into the helix. From what I hear, whether or not the train rolls forward is dependent on weather, how long the train has been stopped, and even how recently the train was rebuilt. When trains do roll forward, they'll sit in place for nearly 5 to 10 seconds before moving. Or sometimes the train will roll forward on its own, but then stop again on the way into the helix. When this happens, the ride mechanics have to use a bit of persuasion to get the train moving again. And if the train doesn't roll forward at all after the brakes release, the mechanics will use the winch to pull the train into the helix. Now this is really only an issue in the morning when a block check is carried out on Loch Ness Monster that basically tests that all the block zones are functioning correctly. As a guest riding the coaster, you'll almost never have to worry about stopping on this brake run. And if it does happen to you, I'd imagine that you'll just be evacuated from the train. Going forward, I hear that the park may be looking to remove the full set of friction brakes in B block and maybe only leaving enough to serve as a trim brake, meaning the brake run would no longer be able to stop trains if necessary and would only be capable of slowing them slightly into the helix. This would certainly fix the headache of getting stopped trains rolling again, but it would eliminate the current B block and the block zone would have to combine with C block like so. This would permanently remove the possibility of 2 trains being in the interlocking loops, since that relies on the existence of B block. Now I don't blame the park for wanting to make this change, especially if the ride only runs 2 trains anyway, but again, if someone important from Busch Gardens is watching, please consider that coaster event I just mentioned before you make that change. I will be there, trust me. But even with Loch Ness Monster's design and build flaws, it has managed to stand the test of time and is currently in its 45th year of operation. The ride is still decently popular, and the track and structure have fared well for a coaster designed and built without the use of computers. The only modifications over the years have been the addition of extra steel cross ties, which are the pieces of steel that connect the running rails to the center spine of the track. The vertical loops initially featured fairly spaced out cross ties compared to the rest of the ride's track. This is odd because the vertical loops are probably the most forceful part of the entire coaster. Over the years, the high G-forces were probably wearing out the running rails faster than hoped for, so additional cross ties were added in between the existing cross ties to help strengthen the rails. Some of the added cross ties are even 2 cross ties that are welded together. You can see the extra thickness of them during the vertical loops. Additional cross ties were also added to the turnaround at the top of the second hill, where the train first enters the left-hand turn, and also to the exit of the large helix leading into the second lift hill. But other than that, the ride has held up wonderfully, and even after 45 years of operation, it hasn't suffered the same problems that both Big Bad Wolf and Drachen Fire did in their much shorter spans of existence. All of Loch Ness Monster's track is lined with a catwalk, and the maintenance team at Busch Gardens does a weekly inspection of the coaster to check on the condition of the track and structure. The park does perform weld repairs to Loch Ness Monster, but to the same extent that is expected with most steel coasters. Thankfully, much of Loch Ness Monster isn't very forceful, which has certainly helped with the ride's longevity, and it doesn't appear that Busch Gardens has any plans to remove the ride in the near future. I think the only major incident that has ever happened on the ride was on June 13th, 1989. A large storm was rapidly approaching and the park ordered all rides be shut down. Heavy winds caused a 60-foot tree to fall and land on the wide right turn following the second lift hill, before the drop into the second vertical loop. By this point, all rides were shut down, but Loch Ness Monster's last train loaded with riders was still rounding the track. It struck the downed tree at about 15 miles per hour. 25 riders were aboard the train, and a 16-year-old in the first car broke his leg in the collision. In total, 5 riders were injured in the accident and taken to the hospital. Riders aboard this train were also terrified by an approaching empty train that had been dispatched after their train as the ride crew cleared the coaster of all passengers. They watched in horror as the train rode through the block break and entered the monster's lair. Thankfully, the block system worked as intended, and the train came to a stop on the second lift hill in C block as the train was stopped in D block. So that will do it for this video on the legendary Loch Ness Monster. The coaster is truly a classic and a great example of Arrow's extraordinary innovation in amusement rides from that era of time. I highly recommend a ride on this coaster because it's truly a classic and is a big reason why we have many of the modern thrill machines in existence today. I hope you all enjoyed this video and I hope you learned something new. Be sure to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel to see more videos like this one. Comment down below what you think about Loch Ness Monster. Alright, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.